Es ist für uns, für jeden heute lebenden Deutschen das höchste Glück, Vollstrecker des Willens des Führers und damit der Geschichte zu sein.
When the sun rose on that fateful day, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands. Without warning or the slightest provocation, they unleashed upon their innocent neighbor the full terror and fury of a devastating blitzkrieg. The force of the Luftwaffe was revealed to a shocked country. A purposeful army floated relentlessly down from the skies to penetrate hard-held lines of defense.
Over the next 5 years, terror reigned from the skies over Holland. Nazi occupation forces killed 75% of Dutch Jews, flooded 1 million acres of land, and starved 20,000 civilians. Considered to have suffered the highest death rate among any Western European country in World War II, 2.4% of the Dutch population was lost. The Dutch endured many hardships before knowing freedom once again, but persevered with hope despite the horrors of their occupation. Throughout World War II, the tragedy suffered by the Dutch people under Nazi occupation, particularly in the final year of the war, would leave lasting scars on the country. Yet, despite facing ruined cities, demolished infrastructure, and starving citizens, the Netherlands was triumphant in its fight to survive during the Hongerwinter of 1944.
They accepted their situation in the proud knowledge that throughout the centuries, the Dutch always have managed to overcome temporary setbacks. Princess Juliana was speaking of people like these when she said, "Keep your pity for the weak, for our terrible fate has made us stronger than ever before."
Following the victories in Normandy the previous June, the morale of the Allied powers fueled an eagerness to defeat the Nazis and end the war in September 1944. German troops were rapidly deteriorating after Nazi territory was pushed back to the Rhine River, spanning across West Europe. American, British, and Canadian forces hoped to advance their attacks through Holland in order to bypass the Siegfried Line and reach the Ruhr territory in order to halt German supply lines. Out of this ambition came Operation Market Garden. A two-pronged attack meant to capture the Dutch bridges in Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem, Operation Market Garden, planned by the British, was set to begin on September 17, 1944. The Dutch government, exiled in London, was eager to spread the news of impending liberation to its people via Radio Orange. Following the broadcast rumors, Hollanders across the country celebrated their anticipated freedom on September 5, 1944, later known as Dolly Dinsdag, or Mad Tuesday. While the celebrations brought hope to the people, the early festivities had powerful consequences on the outcome of the Allied operation. German officials, having heard the rumors, fled the western part of the Netherlands and reinforced German lines at the front in order to combat the attack. By the time Operation Market Garden began 12 days later, the element of surprise was lost. Market Garden consisted of 2 phases, an airborne raid to destabilize German troops and a subsequent land invasion to fully capture the Dutch bridges. The operation was a very ambitious and risky maneuver. It required efficiency and diligence in every aspect. Allied leaders sought to liberate Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem using multiple waves of Allied units. In conjunction with Market Garden, the Dutch government organized a national railway strike, 300,000 Dutch workers strong, in the hopes of slowing German supplies. The strike began the same morning as the operation. Combined, these countermeasures against the Nazis seemed promising, but the Allies quickly found that the Germans were more prepared than originally anticipated. Due to poor planning and inefficient execution, the Allies only succeeded in capturing the bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen, thus liberating southern Holland, but leaving the northern and western provinces still under Nazi occupation. Experts speculate that the bridge at Arnhem could have been captured if the Allies had been more efficient.
So they may have been able to push an armoured battle group up that road. Harmel thinks so, because he very sarcastically said, "And the British stopped for tea."
The loss at Arnhem was a crushing defeat for the Allies, halting their advance to a standstill on the front, now dissecting Holland as a cold and devastating winter drew near. Despite efforts to slow German supplies, the National Railway strike only managed to halt transportation for 10 days until Germans completely bypassed the system. As workers remained on strike, Nazi officials placed a blockade in late September on all shipments in the occupied Netherlands to retaliate against the resistance. The blockade worsened already poor conditions across North and West Holland.
The Dutch government in exile ordered all workers of the Dutch railway to go on strike. The occupation forces immediately reacted by forbidding all transport by the railway from food and coal. So people had nothing to burn to warm their houses, and they had also very less food at their disposal.
With the Netherlands' chief coal provider on the south side of the front in Limburg, fuel became nearly impossible to attain for the Nazi-occupied Dutch. Food supplies quickly followed as over 10% of the country was flooded due to destroyed dikes in previous airstrikes, and transportation became increasingly dependent on maritime trade. Dutch infrastructure was crumbling under Nazi occupation. After 2 months under blockade, the Germans reopened maritime trade in November. However, by that time, the unusually harsh winter had set in and frozen the canals and waterways. With no alternative method of transportation without the threat of airstrikes in active combat zones, the Dutch were trapped. The Hongerwinter had begun.
I remember going to bed hungry every night, and there were people starving, and they came endless knocks on the door with people begging for food just to survive. And every time there was a knock, my oldest Catholic sister answered and gave something to whoever was begging for food. And this went on for a long time, and they always shared. And then came the day there were knocks at the door. And Zus, who was the oldest sister, didn't answer because we didn't have food to share.
As abnormally cold temperatures set in, the Dutch began resorting to drastic means of sustaining themselves. Rationing became more severe, dropping from roughly 1,000 calories daily in November to under 400 in February of 1945. Citizens made long journeys to the countryside in the hopes of trading goods and valuables for food with farmers.
My younger brother went on what they called the Hongertocht to get somewhere from farmers in the neighborhood, potatoes, etc.
Families resorted to eating bread and stew made of tulip bulbs, hair, and potato scraps. Abandoned or destroyed buildings were stripped for fuel to keep houses warm. Due to a scarcity of wood in Amsterdam, corpses were kept in the Protestant church Zuiderkerk in lieu of burial until after liberation. With the few boats that managed to sail within the country, children were sent to the eastern parts of Holland where food was more accessible. Over the course of the harsh winter in 1944 to 1945, roughly 4.5 million people were affected by the famine, over 20,000 of which died of starvation or illness. Queen Wilhelmina in London pled with the Allied forces to send aid to the starving people, but troops struggled to break the barriers surrounding Holland under Nazi control. After 5 months of starvation in March of 1945, Allied aid began reaching parts of northern and eastern Holland. While still unable to send help to the west, Allies supplied the Dutch with Swedish white flour, used to make bread which was rationed out to citizens. In addition to sending supplies to the North and East Netherlands, the Allies, specifically the Canadian forces, continued to fight to liberate Holland as the Nazi regime began to collapse. Finally, after tense negotiations, the Allies made an agreement with the Nazis, signed in late April 1945, in the small town of Achterveld.
Prince Bernhard of Holland joins Canadian staff officers at a conference with German commanders on the Holland front. At a schoolhouse in Achterveld, the German staff arrived to arrange details for the Allied movement of food into starving North Holland. A truce is declared as the Germans are brought to and from the meetings by Canadian transport as food lorries converge on the enemy lines. 150 lorries driven by Canadian drivers take the precious commodities to hungry Hollanders. The cases of Allied food represent the difference between life and death to the war-stricken population.
The signing of the Achterveld Agreement not only began the final negotiations for Nazi surrender, but also initiated Operations Manna and Chowhound, both airborne efforts by British and American forces to drop food over the occupied regions of the Netherlands. In the final days of the war, American and British bombers dropped over 11,000 tons of life-saving food and supplies over the war-stricken territory.
B-17s were loaded with U.S. Army rations to be dropped to starving Dutch civilians. Some missions had to be scrubbed when German commanders were reluctant to negotiate a short armistice, guaranteeing planes safe passage on the mercy runs. By May 1st, enough food had been dropped to feed 4 million persons for one day. In contrast to the days when Nazi planes brought destruction to Rotterdam, Allied planes were now bringing Dutch cities sustenance.
On May 5, 1945, almost 5 years after the Battle of the Netherlands, the Dutch people were finally liberated. Having suffered horrendous casualties, destruction, and starvation as the longest occupied country in World War II, Hollanders were left with the scars of a war-torn nation that continue to influence their lives today. As the world celebrated its triumph over a tragic war, the Dutch were filled with the same hope that helped them survive occupation and would help them to persevere and rebuild their nation despite the setbacks they faced. In an address to the Canadian people, Princess Juliana of the Netherlands implored, "Whatever you do, do not give me your pity. No woman ever felt as proud as I do today of the marvelous heritage of my own people. And so, more than ever before, we have reason to be proud of being called by the ancient name of our glorious old country of Holland. Keep your pity for the weak, for our terrible fate has made us stronger than ever before."